This afternoon with 17 bills representing priorities of members on both sides of the aisle, including several members of this committee. Several bills on this afternoon's agenda have been before the committee in previous years. Although many of the issues are familiar, we wanted to allow committee members the opportunity to get updated information and ask any questions that they might have. Most of the bills on today's agenda are state-specific. Many of the more comprehensive land bills are the product of years of on-the-ground work to try and develop a local consensus on the appropriate balance of the many competing priorities for use of our public lands. After members of the committee have had an opportunity to provide opening statements, we will hear from Senator Bennett when he gets here to introduce two of his bills that he and Senator Hickenlooper have sponsored. Following that, we will then hear from our representatives from the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service, who will provide the administration's testimony on the bills, and from state witnesses on three of the bills before us today. Before concluding, I want to say a few remarks on the three bills that I have sponsored. Regarding the first one, this is S622, the End Speculative Oil and Gas Leasing Act. This bill establishes a process by which the BLM shall assess federal land parcels' oil and gas development potential before offering those lands for lease, and then prohibiting leasing on any lands determined to have low or no development potential. The bill does not apply to existing leases and applies only to future leasing decisions. As a result of this bill would benefit the management of our public lands by accomplishing the following. By excluding lands with no potential from leasing, it would largely end the practice of speculative leasing by encouraging both BLM and oil and gas companies to focus exploration and drilling activities on lands with higher development potential. It also allows the BLM to prioritize areas without development potential for other uses, such as conservation, grazing, mining, recreation, or renewable energy development. And it reduces costs associated with preparing low potential lands for auctions and then issuing and monitoring those non-producing leases. The bill's common sense, middle ground approach, it allows lands to be periodically reassessed for their development potential should new data or technologies prove an area's development viability. The next bill that I'm introducing is S1760. This is the Apex Area Technical Corrections Act. This legislation would make it easier to grow existing businesses and open new businesses in the Apex Industrial Park in North Las Vegas. The bill allows the City of North Las Vegas and the Apex Industrial Park Owners Association to be granted managing authority of utility and transportation rights of way for the connection of electric power, water, natural gas, rail and road facilities, and other utilities at the Apex Industrial Park. Although the Apex site is managed by a public-private partnership, the 1989 law creating the industrial park directed the BLM to issue utility rights of way across this site. This has often resulted in a lengthy permitting process for businesses that need to construct necessary infrastructure across the BLM-managed utility corridors. The bill provides relief to Apex's complicated permitting process to really deliver faster, more efficient permits for new and existing businesses looking to expand their operations. The third bill I have introduced, and it's on the schedule today and on the agenda, is S2042. This is the Sloan Canyon Conservation and Horizon Lateral Water Pipeline Act. This bill expands the Sloan Canyon National Conservation Area by 9,290 acres, and it improves the water reliability system in the southern portion of the Las Vegas Valley by providing a right-of-way for the proposed southern alignment of a water conveyance project known as the Horizon Lateral, a portion of which would be placed underneath Sloan Canyon. The Horizon Lateral provides redundancy and flexibility to the lone existing water pipeline that serves 40% of the residents and businesses in the Las Vegas Valley, including the city of Henderson, which is about 322,000 people. The existing 25-year-old South Valley Lateral will reach 95% capacity in a decade and will not be able to safely and reliably serve residents and businesses in the Las Vegas Valley for the long term. As will be discussed by one of our witnesses, John Ensminger from the Southern Nevada Water Authority, the placement of this water pipeline is the community's preferred route to the alternative that would otherwise run through the city of Henderson, causing greater traffic congestion and disturbance to residents and businesses, cost ratepayers an additional $200 million, and considerably delay the completion of construction beyond 2030. The preferred route for the Horizon Lateral significantly minimizes impacts to the natural and built environment and is broadly supported by the state, Clark County, City of Henderson, local business associations, homeowner associations, labor organizations, travel and tourism associations, and local conservation organizations. So at this time, I'd also like to recognize my colleague and ranking member, Senator Lee, for his opening statement.
Thanks so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for convening this important subcommittee hearing. And I want to thank our witnesses also, many of whom have traveled a pretty far distance in order to be here. I've introduced two bills that'll be on today's legislative hearing agenda. S-2136, the Utah State Parks Adjustment Act, and S-1405, the Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration Exchange Act of 2023. These bills will improve land management in the great state of Utah while also promoting responsible stewardship and local control. In particular, I'd like to thank Director Michelle McConkey of the Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration. That is a mouthful, but she's up to the task of handling this entity with a big name and an even bigger task. The entity known as CITLA is much easier to pronounce when you don't use the whole name. Director McConkey, of course, grew up in rural Utah and has worked for CITLA in a number of capacities over the last 2 decades and has developed a real expertise and a strong reputation for professionalism and competency in this area. She's someone who personally understands the needs of rural communities and the many nuances of public land and public land management. Under her leadership, CITLA ensures that roughly $95 million of funding per year are responsibly generated and dispersed from CITLA into a trust fund for the benefit of Utah's public schools. For the non-Utahns in the room, CITLA trust lands are parceled in individual 1 square mile sections. And if you've ever looked at a map of Utah, you'll notice that it resembles a checkerboard. And one of the many reasons for this is because the unique layout of CITLA's lands, where Utah was given sections 2, 16, 32, and 36 to each 36-mile township, creating this nice checkerboard formation and a pattern that if we suddenly didn't have the ability to write would be easily recognizable to anyone as CITLA lands. CITLA is tasked with managing roughly 3.4 million acres of trust lands in Utah, and also the revenues generated from the lands in the most prudent and profitable manner possible, and not for any purpose inconsistent with the best interests of the trust beneficiaries. Trust lands, unlike public lands, are lands allocated by Congress to generate revenue to support specific state institutions, including state schools, public schools in the state, and also state hospitals. The proceeds generated by the program are deposited into a trust fund totaling over $2 billion today. Led by Director McConkey, CITLA works really hard and very effectively to ensure that the trust lands of Utah generate the economic prosperity to fund public institutions and create economic opportunity, particularly for rural communities. It's been a privilege to work with CITLA, as well as various people from the state of Utah, the Bureau of Land Management, and other local stakeholders in creating consensus-driven land exchange to benefit the school kids and rural communities of Utah. So I'm pleased to present legislation that codifies a memorandum of understanding signed by Governor Cox and Secretary Holland. This MOU facilitates the exchange of 162,000 acres of state trust land within the Bears Ears National Monument for 167,000 acres of BLM land elsewhere in the state. To be sure, there's nothing about this bill that means that many issues surrounding the designation of the Bears Ears National Monument somehow been settled. Far from it. Through an abuse of the Antiquities Act, over 1.3 million acres of land in San Juan County, the poorest county in Utah, was locked up in a new national monument overnight. Despite opposition from local communities and the entire Utah congressional delegation at the time when this occurred on December 28th, 2016. San Juan County is forced to deal with the burdens created by the monument designation, increased costs associated with law enforcement, search and rescue, road maintenance, waste, and visitation, and is unable to generate much revenue, all because of a restrictive monument designation the size of Delaware within one county. Given these issues, the decision to proceed with this land exchange was a complicated, delicate, and sometimes a harrowing process that came a long way over the last 2 years. While certainly not a perfect deal, this exchange strikes a balance, a fair balance, that's been driven by local stakeholder input. The bill presents a unique opportunity to provide economic development opportunities that will provide serious long-term benefits to the school children of Utah. The current trust lands within the Bears Ears National Monument, within the boundaries of that monument, generate little revenue for the school trust. SITLA has gone above and beyond the call of duty to identify parcels throughout the state, and especially, particularly in San Juan County, which have potential to generate revenue and otherwise be sources of economic development. This bill has received letters of support from Carbon County, San Pete County, Sevier, Millard, Duchesne, Beaver, Emery, and Uintah counties, along with Governor Spencer Cox, as well as other leaders, including tribal leaders and conservation groups. I ask unanimous consent that these letters be entered into the record.
Without objection.
I'd also like to highlight another piece of legislation, S 2136, which would convey a few small parcels of federal land to the state of Utah. These parcels are either in holdings or they're located directly adjacent to Utah state park boundaries. A lot of people remember Utah for our national parks, which are fantastic, and I'd encourage everyone to use them and visit them. We're less well known for our state parks, which are well managed, well staffed, well cared for, and really beautiful places. State parks play a vital role in promoting outdoor recreation, tourism, and economic growth in Utah. However, the presence of federal enclaves and fragmented ownership, exacerbated by the fact that the federal government owns 2/3 of the land in Utah, tends to create unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles and land management inefficiencies that complicate all sorts of endeavors, including the management of state parks. These parcels include additions to the Wasatch Mountain State Park, Antelope Island State Park, and Fremont State Park. By transferring title of these small parcels of land to the state, we'll consolidate land ownership, simplify management, and enhance the overall efficiency of our state park system. This will enable the Utah State Park system to better preserve and protect these natural treasures for future generations. I thank the members for their thoughtful consideration of these bills that are before us today, and I hope today's testimony can help satisfy and resolve any concerns that members of the subcommittee might have, and that we'll be able to expedite these bills out of committee and into legislation on the floor with all due haste and deliberate speed. Thank you, and yield back my time.
Thank you. Now's the time for any committee members to provide opening statements. Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And for my constituents who live in rural Oregon, this is truly an exhilarating and exciting occasion. After decades and decades of back and forth arguments for one position or not, debates about the role of the federal government, the possibility of a monument, we have been able to come together for the Malheur Community Empowerment for the Oahe Act. And Madam Chair, I'm going to give a brief statement, but I'd like to put into the record a document that we have never seen before in our region, a letter indicating that ranchers, conservationists, the tribes, all of the small businesses have come out strongly for this proposal, and I would ask unanimous consent that it be part of the record.
Without objection.
So, Madam President and colleagues, as I was telling my colleague from New Mexico, if you read the write-ups from back east, they always call it Oregon's version of the Grand Canyon. We really call it home. And what I can tell you is this really began once again after decades of back and forth when some ranchers came to see me in the winter of 2018 and asked me to try yet again to bring all the parties together and see if we could pass legislation to have a community-driven approach to the Oahe. And they looked a little bit sheepish. They looked at their shoes. And finally, I asked one of them, is the reality that you're here to see me today a fact that you basically think I'm the only one crazy enough to be willing to take one more try at coming together? And the rancher smiled, and being the kind of blunt sorts, one of them said, yup, that's exactly why we're here. And that began our effort to try to find common ground. And what I will tell you is there's a lesson for everybody as it relates to our work on building these kind of coalitions. If you can, see if you can muster up an uncommon amount of common sense, because that is how my constituents in Eastern Oregon pulled this together. And we have a piece of legislation that preserves not just a treasured landscape for its beauty and ecological significance, but importantly, it preserves our agriculture culture and way of life for people who call it home. It provides grazing and operational flexibility for permit holders on BLM lands designed to preserve environmental integrity, delivers additional certainty and management direction for roughly 2 million acres of public land in Malheur County, designating half as wilderness, and ensures the rest is managed for multiple uses. It creates the Malheur County Empowerment for the Oahe Group, an organization of local ranchers, environmental groups, and tribal representation to advise on flexible grazing management and help develop projects to improve landscape health. There's transfers of 30,000 acres into trust for the Burns Paiute tribe and creates a larger co-stewardship area for the tribe and the BLM on these culturally significant lands. And it spurs economic development for a region very much in need of it through provisions to develop recreational opportunities and other amenities. Fundamentally, and I appreciate the chair's indulgence on this, we've all got a hectic day, it represents a locally driven solution. Thousands of miles from Washington, D.C. is this wonderful place that we call the Oahe, and they're going to drive the approach that ranchers and conservationists and the tribes have come up with. So this is a really big day for my constituents in Eastern Oregon. A couple of my constituents said recently they're pinching themselves to believe that we actually got this agreement. Madam Chair, I would ask unanimous consent as I wrap up. I've got a couple of questions for the Bureau of Land Management. They've been very supportive in terms of providing counsel, and we wrote the legislation to provide management direction to the BLM based on local input from the community, and the BLM has been very supportive, and I would ask unanimous consent if those questions be part of the record. And I thank all my colleagues who've been very patient. And I know Senator Heinrich and I are both going to end up in the committee we can't talk much about, and Senator Bennett will a little bit later. So I thank my colleagues for all the time.
Thank you. Without objection. Any other opening statements? Senator Daines.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. Today we're going to hear testimony on one of my bills, which is the Montana Sportsman Conservation Act. This is something that isn't just words for me. It's something that we live vigorously and passionately in our family. I know how important public lands are to Montanans. Local input and the best available science should guide land management decisions. But unfortunately, congressional inaction has left many areas in Montana in limbo. In 1976, in 1977, Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act and the Montana Wilderness Study Act, calling on the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service to determine if 47 wilderness study areas were suitable for a permanent wilderness designation. And let the record show, I am not opposed to adding more wilderness. In fact, we've done this in a bipartisan way, adding more wilderness in Montana. The first time in decades we did this together several years ago. In fact, my wife and I love spending a good chunk of time in August in the Beartooth Wilderness area ourselves. If you came to my office, you'd see a great big topo map of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. You'll see a little red pin on every lake that we have been to up in that area. And it's been a lifetime. I could probably write a book on which particular fly works in which particular lake, chasing which particular species of fish. And sometimes it confounds members on the other side that there's a Republican that actually understands and spends as much time in wilderness as anybody else here on Capitol Hill. These studies were completed in 1979 and 1991. But decades of DC inaction have prevented increased access to our public lands because these wilderness study areas are managed as de facto wilderness areas, even though Congress has not deemed them wilderness. We need more flexible management framework that should be guided by local communities who are closest to these lands, as Senator Wyden pointed out. Yeah, it's great to see local voices in regards to these federal lands. This bill I have will help unlock some of these lands and return more access to public hands. We need to go back and look at what did Congress say when these policies were passed back in 76 and 77. They said the Forest Service has 5 years to complete the studies and make the recommendations to Congress, and we need to act on it. BLM had 15 years. Look, we're going back to 76 and 77. We are way overdue to take action to deem which are suitable for wilderness, which are not, and act on it appropriately. Release those that are not suitable for wilderness, and those that are suitable, we should be moving forward for wilderness proposals. Look, we have 3.4 million acres of wilderness in Montana. Since 1976, when the first of these wilderness study areas were created, now 1.8 million Montana acres have been designated as permanent wilderness. However, only 150,000 acres have been returned to general management. These are the study areas. And 1.1 million Montana acres remain locked up as de facto wilderness when that was never, ever the intent of Congress, despite the Forest Service and BLM recommending that the majority of these acres be returned to general management and multiple use. Following a multi-year collaborative process with strong public comment spanning multiple administrations, the 3 areas in my bill, covering just over 100,000 acres, were recently deemed unsuitable for wilderness management yet again. Montanans are tired of going through the process of studying and providing input on these areas and then not seeing any action or resolution. This imbalance in inaction is unacceptable, and I'm determined to fix it. My Montana Sportsman Conservation Act will improve the ability to restore wildlife habitat, enhance sportsman opportunity, mitigate wildfire risk, and increase public access to public lands in Montana. I'd like to clear up some misinformation about what would occur if we return these lands to general management. Each land management plan contains a blueprint that was created with public input for managing these areas post-release. And these plans maintain important protections while allowing the land agencies more flexibility in how they manage the landscapes. This flexibility is critical as we head into another fire season to give the agencies the tools they need to properly manage these forests and reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire devastating our forests. In summary, my bill would mean more public access and more public input for public lands. I also understand Senator Tester's Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act is on the agenda today as well. I know this bill derives from a local collaborative agreement. I spent a lot of time in that part of our state hunting spring bear. They've received input from timber stakeholders, from wilderness advocates, from outfitters. I commend the hard work of that collaborative approach. I do think we need more work. We can find a balanced approach. There is a path forward to get this done, but we just got to get back to thinking about the wilderness study areas and finding a bipartisan way to move this across the finish line. I'd like to see that happen, but we've got more work to do on that Blackwater Clearwater Stewardship Act. Madam Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. Any other senators on committee like to make an opening statement? Senator
Madam Chair.
Cohen.
I want to, first of all, thank you for including S 1015 and S 1657 in this hearing. And I was proud to introduce the first bill earlier this Congress with Representative Crane leading efforts in the House. The transfer of this 232-acre area will allow Gila County to build a Veterans Center in Young, Arizona that will serve not only the nearly 5,500 military veterans who call Gila County home, but also veterans throughout rural Arizona. And this center will be the first of its kind in northern Arizona, providing the community with a space to gather. Additionally, this new center will also serve as a mobile clinic for veterans who can't easily access a VA medical center. This is going to help address some of the disparities facing veterans living in rural areas and improving their long-term health outcomes. As a Navy veteran myself, I'm committed to keeping America's promises to our veterans and delivering the care and benefits that they've earned. And this piece of legislation provides a place for our veterans in Gila County and will help veterans in a rural area of northern Arizona get the support and resources that they need. And I appreciate the Forest Service's support of this bill in Deputy Chief French's written testimony. Senator Sinema and I introduced the second bill, which would transfer 4,800 acres from the Bureau of Land Management to La Paz County at fair market value. And this land will be used for solar energy projects, attracting economic development opportunities to an underserved community. And that's going to create good-paying Arizona jobs and facilitate the transition to clean energy and ensure La Paz County's economy continues to grow. And, Mr. Heinlein, who I believe is here, appreciate you testifying today and BLM's commitment to making the bill work for everyone. So, Madam Chair, thank you for holding this hearing.
Thank you. Anyone else on committee? Senator Hoven.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just briefly, I have legislation which I will be introducing, or which I on the agenda today. And I also want to make an introduction, but the legislation is the North Dakota Trust Lands Completion Act. And essentially what it does is that it's legislation that I am leading on behalf of our North Dakota delegation. Senator Kramer is also a co-sponsor, and we have House sponsorship of it as well. Currently, North Dakota has more than 130,000 acres of minerals and over 31,000 acres, surface acres, located within tribal reservations in our state that are largely unavailable for development. So this legislation creates a streamlined process which will enable North Dakota to access the land and the minerals promised upon statehood to fund education, while at the same time providing the tribes with ownership over lands that are within their boundaries. So it's a win for the state of North Dakota. It's a win for our tribes as well. And I had hoped to introduce Joe Herringer, who is here today, but I'm going to have to go beforehand. So just briefly, if I could, just take a couple minutes and do a quick introduction. Joe Herringer is our North Dakota Commissioner of University and School Lands, and he'll talk more about the act. And I do hope to be back to ask him a few questions. It's just timing-wise, I can't get him for his introduction. And of course, I'm dying to hear what Senator Bennett has to say too. So I want to kind of keep this moving. But Commissioner Herringer earned a degree from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, and his law degree at the University of North Dakota. And he leads our North Dakota Department of Land Trust. I've known him for a long time, and I'm really appreciative that he not only took the initiative to do this, which I say is a win for this state and for our tribes in North Dakota, but has worked very hard, very diligently on it, and is here with us today. So thank you so much, Madam Chair. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Anyone else on committee? Senator Bennett, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I'd like to recognize the distinguished public service of Senator Hoven, the former governor, no, I'm just kidding, but thank you for your acknowledgement and for being here. And Madam Chair, thank you for allowing me to appear here again. To the members of the committee that are here, my great colleague, Senator Hickenlooper, thank you for the opportunity to once again speak about two bills that are very, very important to Colorado. the Dolores River National Conservation Area and Special Management Area Act, and the Colorado Outdoor and Recreation Economy, or CORE Act, that Senator Hickenlooper and I are championing together. Coloradans crafted these bills on kitchen tables and at trailheads across our state. The bills were written in Colorado, not in Washington, and they reflect thoughtful, bipartisan collaboration among tribes, county commissioners, businesses, ranches, sportsmen, and conservationists. Last month, my family and I rafted the Dolores River, and I know I speak for everybody when I say it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. We all came off the river inspired and more committed than ever to protect this remote and beautiful area. I should say that the people that somehow don't get mentioned in these hearings sometimes are the guides that take you down on these rafts, and the folks from Mile to Wild did an amazing job. Anna, who is in our boat with my daughters and with my wife, could not have been more extraordinary, and their lives, their economy is dedicated to the public lands and to the rivers that this committee, this Congress represents. It was interesting to have a conversation with all of them about that, and the next day, literally the day, I think the second day that we were on the trip on the Dolores, another guide, Sarah Rosecrans, also from the same company, actually lost her life in the Upper Animas River as she was trying to practice for the people that would come to raft. So when you say, or when I say, and Martin says, or John's, the rest of us say that these folks are dedicating their lives to the outdoors, that is actually what's happening. And I just want to say thank you to Anna and the rest of her crew, and to Sarah for their inspiration. The Dolores River is internationally known for its staggering red rock walls that tower over Ponderosa Pines, and the Dolores is also the lifeblood of western Colorado, supplying water to our farmers, our ranchers, our outdoor recreation enthusiasts. This bill represents a balanced, hard-fought, common-sense way forward to resolve generations-long community disagreements, protect the river for everybody, and provide long-term certainty for generations. In fact, I would never have been even able to introduce this bill without the bipartisan support of people living near the river who might not agree on anything else but have come to an agreement on this river. Republican and Democratic county commissioners in 3 counties in southwest Colorado, along with the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, local agricultural and ranching interests, and conservation groups all support our bill to protect the Dolores. And there's no reason, wonder why. They know that they have an obligation to protect it for their kids and for their grandkids, and if they don't do it, they know nobody else will. And that's why earlier this year, every Republican in the Colorado delegation, in the House of Representatives, joined together to introduce an identical version of this bill in the House. And before I ask you for your support, I want to also answer Senator Heinrich's question about snaggletooth, which was you enter the right of the poor, and then you work your way left. And that is how you get through the snaggletooth, and that's how you avoid the big rocks. And, of course, Anna was the one avoiding the big rocks, but that's what we did. And then I've got to mention also while I'm here the CORE Act. Madam Chair, please allow me to describe this important bill, also written in Colorado. Many of you have heard me discuss this bill over the years, so I'll be brief today. But Coloradans of all stripes have been working on the CORE Act for over a decade to conserve over 420,000 acres of public lands in Colorado. County commissioners across the political spectrum, outfitters, ranchers, hunters, and anglers, and local businesses all came together to hammer out a compromise and find the best way forward to protect iconic places like the Thompson Divide and the San Juan Mountains. And I ask this committee to honor the incredible bipartisan work that was done to create this legislation. And as evidence of the broad coalition that is fighting to pass the CORE Act and the Dolores River, Madam Chair, I come with letters and testimony from counties, tribal leaders, conservation groups, sportsmen, water districts, and community leaders supporting each of these bills. I ask unanimous consent that these letters be entered into the hearing record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I close, I'd like to ask for your support and the support of the committee to move this legislation forward. The CORE Act, like the Dolores River Bill, reflect the kind of bipartisan consensus that should be honored by this Senate. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. This time, I'd like to introduce our witness panel, invite them to come to the table, testifying table. So we welcome the following individuals to this subcommittee today. Thomas Heinlein, the Assistant Director for National Conservation Lands and Community Partnerships at the Bureau of Land Management. Chris French, the Deputy Chief for the Forest Service. As you've heard earlier, John Ensminger, a fellow Nevadan and the General Manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, who will be testifying with respect to S2042, the Sloan Canyon National Conservation Area and Horizon Lateral Water Pipeline. Michelle McConkey, the Director of the Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, will be talking on Senate Bill 1405, the Utah BLM Land Exchange Bill. And Joseph Herringer, the Commissioner of University and School Trust Lands at the North Dakota Department of Trust Lands. I invite each of you to limit your oral statements to no more than 5 minutes, and after everyone on the panel has had a chance to give their opening statement, we will then go into a round of questions from the committees. Mr. Heinlein, I'm going to ask you to start with your statement. Welcome.
Thank you. Chairwoman Cortez Masto, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on 12 bills on the hearing agenda today related to the Bureau of Land Management. I'm Tom Heinlein, BLM's Assistant Director for National Conservation Lands and Community Partnerships. The BLM manages approximately 245 million surface acres located primarily in 12 western states, as well as 30% of the nation's onshore mineral resources across 700 million subsurface acres under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. The BLM is committed to its core mission of multiple use and sustained yield, which provides for careful balancing across many uses and resources to steward public lands for all people. We appreciate the sponsors' work on the bills under consideration today, which apply to several facets of the BLM's broad multiple-use mandate. I'll briefly touch on the BLM-related bills on the agenda. The department supports several of the bills under consideration that align with the administration's conservation goals and efforts to restore balance on public lands and waters. This includes S1405, which facilitates the exchange of state-owned land within or near the Bears Ears National Monument in Utah for BLM managed public lands. The bill would promote conservation and appropriate resource management in a manner consistent with the 2016 and 2021 presidential proclamations protecting the monument, including the protection of invaluable cultural resources and sites. Lands within the monument are profoundly sacred to many tribal nations and contain evidence of thousands of years of occupation by indigenous peoples. The bill will ensure the acquired lands are managed to protect their cultural and natural resources and improve management of the monument by reducing the checkerboard effect from lands that the state is statutorily required to manage for revenue generation. In addition, the BLM strongly supports S1634, which designates the McKenna Peaks Wilderness on BLM-managed public lands in Colorado and withdraws the Thompson Divide from the public land and mineral development laws. The BLM also supports S1776 and S1890, which together designate approximately 1.7 million acres of wilderness in California and Oregon, as well as S636, which establishes the Dolores River National Conservation and Special Management Areas in Colorado. S 2136 directs the conveyance of isolated federal parcels within or adjacent to the Antelope Island and Wasatch Mountain State Parks in Utah, and the BLM supports these conveyances. Regarding S 2216, the Montana Sportsman Conservation Act, which would release over 103,000 acres of federal lands from wilderness study area designation, the BLM recommends further evaluation of these WSAs, as wilderness and wilderness study areas are essential components of conservation that are critical for ecosystem health and biodiversity. S 1088 would authorize the relinquishment to the Secretary of the Interior of certain lands and mineral estate granted to the state of North Dakota that are located within the boundaries of 4 tribal reservations in the state. The BLM supports the sponsor's goal of addressing the patchwork of inholdings within existing reservation boundaries, and we're committed to managing public lands in a manner that seeks to protect the treaty, religious, subsistence, and cultural interests of federally recognized tribes. The BLM also supports the goals of S 1657, which would direct the conveyance of BLM-managed public lands to promote renewable energy development in La Paz County, Arizona. Both S 1760 and S 2042 authorize rights-of-way to facilitate development of public infrastructure in Nevada. The BLM would like to work with the sponsor of S 1760 to ensure that it retains discretion on the issuance of future rights-of-ways. And while the BLM supports the expansion of the Sloan Canyon National Conservation Area in S 2042, the BLM would like to work with the sponsor to ensure the core values and resources identified for protection by the creation of the Sloan Canyon National Conservation Area remain protected. S 1622, meanwhile, would prohibit the leasing of federal lands for oil and gas development that have been identified as having low or no oil and gas potential. The BLM strongly supports the goal of improving federal onshore oil and gas leasing process and would like the opportunity to work with the sponsor on technical modifications to aid in the bill's implementation. Finally, the National Park Service and the Bureau of Reclamation have submitted statements for the record on S 1254 and S 2020. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify on these bills, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Mr. French.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman Cortez Masto and Ranking Member Lee and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present the viewpoint of the USDA Forest Service regarding 9 public land bills that are presently under consideration. With the responsibility of managing 193 million acres of national forests and grasslands, the Forest Service plays a critical role in conserving our nation's extensive public lands. Our mission encompasses recreation, grazing, water, timber, and mineral production, watershed conservation, wildlife and fish habitat conservation, and broad-scale landscape conservation. We are stewards of 448 wilderness areas and more than 5,000 miles of wild and scenic rivers. Many of today's bills add to those systems and align to the administration's broader climate and conservation goals expressed through executive orders and Secretary Vilsack's secretarial memorandum. National Forest Service critical contributors to the American economy. Recreation activities contribute over $13.7 billion to the country's gross domestic product and directly support more than 160,000 jobs. Each year, more than 156 million Americans visit our national forests. Many of today's bills recognize this growing use and facilitate the continued growth of our recreation-based economy. S 1015 directs the Secretary of Agriculture to transfer a 234-acre parcel of land of unused Forest Service administrative sites to Gila County, Arizona, for the purpose of providing services to veterans. USDA supports this bill as a straightforward and common-sense solution to provide Gila County with a facility that they can use. The Utah State Parks Adjustment Act directs the Secretary of Agriculture to convey a Forest Service parcel of 272 acres to the state of Utah. The primary purpose of this would be to transfer a campground that is already being administered by the state parks for the county. The proposal makes sense, and we are generally supportive of the bill and would like to work with the bill sponsor on a few issues, including some existing uses, mapping, and water rights. The end of the Speculative Oil and Gas Leasing Act establishes conditions under which the BLM may issue federal oil and gas leases. USDA supports the bill's noted effect and defers to the BLM's testimony for other aspects of the bill. The Montana Sportsman's Conservation Act would release 3 wilderness study areas located in Montana, with one of them occurring on the Helena, Lewis, and Clark National Forests. USDA would like to better understand the purpose and need for the legislation from the bill's sponsor. The Wild Olympics Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers Act designates new and expands existing wilderness areas, potential wilderness areas, and certain rivers in the Olympic National Forest and Olympic National Park as wild and scenic rivers. USDA supports this bill and would like to work with the committee and the bill sponsor to address some technical and timing concerns. The Core Act includes management provisions for national forests in Colorado, including the designation of new wilderness areas, designation of wildlife conservation areas, mineral withdrawals, boundary modifications, and transfer of administrative jurisdiction of National Forest System lands. USDA supports the bill and its focus on expanding recreation and defers to the Department of Interior for their views on the bill as it affects public lands under their jurisdiction as well. The Public Lands Act provides for protection of and investment in certain federal lands in California. USDA supports the overall goals of the Public Lands Act, but would like to work with the subcommittee and bill sponsor to ensure that the timeframes identified are implementable, ensure that it's consistent with the Wilderness Act, address concerns with areas proposed for new designations that are not consistent with existing forest plan decisions, and ensure that geographic descriptions for wilderness boundaries and trails are correct. The proposed Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act is the product of a collaborative effort, and we appreciate the benefits this legislation could provide to Montana's communities and the Lolo National Forest. The bill creates 2 new recreation management areas, directs the Secretary of Agriculture to develop a landscape assessment of watershed conditions and restoration needs, and to develop a 10-year schedule of restoration projects following the assessment. We support and will continue to work with the bill sponsor to ensure the bill will complement the current ongoing land management plan revision process that's occurring. Finally, the Dolores River National Conservation Area and Special Management Area designates over 15,000 acres of National Forest System lands in the San Juan as a special management area. USDA supports and appreciates the broad support that's been developed for this bill that has been established throughout Southwest Colorado. This concludes my remarks, and I look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ensminger.
Chair Cortez Masto, Ranking Member Lee, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today in support of S 2042. I've testified before Congress several times on drought and the effects of increasing temperatures on the Colorado River system. Today, I am here to advocate for the passage of S 2042, a bill that addresses another critical water challenge for Southern Nevada, reliability. In our water system, reliability and redundancy go hand in hand. It's the reason we have recently installed $1.5 billion in infrastructure to ensure our access to water from Lake Mead, infrastructure that did not increase our ability to take more Colorado River water by a single gallon. The Horizon Lateral, a component of this legislation, is an infrastructure project designed to create redundancy to ensure that we can deliver 375 million gallons of water from one side of Las Vegas to the other. It's a project that remedies vulnerabilities within our water conveyance system. Our existing South Valley Lateral is the lone transmission line that handles water deliveries to the southern portion of Las Vegas. It's 25 years old, and it is imperative that we secure the ability to shut the lateral down for maintenance or emergency situations. A failure in this part of our system would disrupt water service to approximately 1 million residents and 40% of area businesses, potentially impacting public health and economic stability. Let me be clear. Disruption does not mean that water service would be curtailed or reduced. In the event of a shutdown, there is no other way for us to get water to this part of our system. We analyzed 92,000 pipeline segments and narrowed the Horizon Lateral project down to 2 options. A northern alternative contemplates building through densely populated urban areas. Construction along this route would involve 50-foot wide trenches within several major roadways. It would snarl traffic and restrict timely access to schools, hospitals, homes, businesses, and other essential services. These are not minor inconveniences, but major disruptions that would last for many years. Conversely, as proposed within S 2042, the southern route is more feasible, will cost at least $200 million less than the northern alternative, and be far less disruptive to the community. The alignment includes subsurface tunneling beneath the Sloan Canyon National Conservation Area. Infrastructure crossing the NCA will be constructed through an underground tunnel 50 to 2,000 feet below land surface with no discernible vibrations. The tunnel entrance and tunnel exit will be located outside of the NCA. except for geotechnical borehole work to be performed using airlifted equipment to a limited number of small areas that we will restore to their original condition, there will be zero construction on the surface area disturbance on the NCA. All other project components are outside of the NCA boundaries. The Bureau of Land Management manages the NCA. Notwithstanding the known benefits of the southern alignment, BLM advised us that permitting a right-of-way under the NCA to support the Horizon Lateral is outside the scope of its authority. That is why we are seeking your support to move the project forward through the passage of this legislation. The best way to meet 21st century challenges is to identify and resolve risks early, proactively, and with well-laid plans. That's precisely what SNWA has been doing for more than 20 years. This strategy has helped us to identify top priorities and to develop response measures that have and will continue to secure our community's water future, from pioneering conservation programs and initiatives that have significantly reduced our water demands to constructing multi-billion-dollar facilities to protect our water supply access. We have been thoughtful, innovative, and quick in protecting Southern Nevada's water security interests while being good partners and stewards of the environment. The SNWA has the experience and track record to complete the Horizon Lateral project as proposed in S 2042. Your support will allow us to remedy vulnerabilities in our water system while avoiding major disruptions to the community and protecting important NCA resources. Lastly, I would like to note for the record that construction of the Horizon Lateral will not increase Nevada's ability to take Colorado River water by a single drop. I thank you for your time and stand ready to answer any questions.
Thank you. Ms. McConkey.
Chairwoman Cortez Masto, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'd also like to thank Ranking Member Lee, Representative Curtis, and the entire Utah congressional delegation for their support and connection with the legislation now before the subcommittee. My name is Michelle McConkey. I'm the Director of the State of Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration. We'll call it SITLA to make it a little easier. It's a state agency that manages state trust lands that were granted by Congress at statehood for the financial support of public education and other state institutions. SITLA manages approximately 3.4 million acres of state trust lands and an additional 1 million acres of severed mineral estate. Revenue from activities on these lands is invested, and annual distributions are made to every public school in the state to help with each school's most pressing academic need. S 1405 would ratify and authorize implementation of a March 17, 2023 land exchange agreement between SITLA, Utah Governor Spencer Cox, and Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland. That agreement is the product of over a year and a half of discussions between the state, federal land managers, local governments, and other interested stakeholders. The proposed exchange is supported by rural county governments, various stakeholders, Governor Cox, and the Utah legislature. The fundamental problem addressed by this legislation is the issue of scattered state land inholdings embedded within federal conservation areas such as national monuments and associated land management conflicts. The designation of the Bears Ears National Monument captured more than 200 scattered tracts of state trust land within its outer boundaries, totaling over 126,000 acres. The state has been charged by Congress with managing these school trust lands for the financial benefit of Utah's public education system through revenue-generating activities. But restrictions on the use of surrounding federal lands through establishment of the monument will limit the utility of the in-held state trust lands for economic development. And development of school trust lands within national monuments and other designations is directly at odds with the conservation purposes for which the surrounding federal lands were set aside. These conflicting mandates and the checkerboard pattern of state trust lands inholdings will make effective management of both state trust lands and the monument itself very difficult, if not impossible. While the declaration of the monument and its large geographic scope are matters of significant controversy and litigation between the state of Utah and the United States, both governments agree that trading out state land inholdings is in everyone's best interests. Land exchanges are an effective solution to the management conflicts associated with inholdings. In the last 25 years, the state of Utah and the United States have worked successfully to complete a series of large, congressionally authorized land exchanges. The hallmark of each of these exchanges was their win-win nature. School trust lands with significant environmental values were placed into federal ownership, while federal lands with lesser environmental values but greater potential for revenue generation were exchanged to the state. S 1405 authorizes the conveyance to the United States of over 162,500 acres of Utah State School trust lands and minerals within and near the Bears Ears National Monument, as well as additional lands near the Bonneville Salt Flats of the Great Salt Lake and other areas of the state where management conflicts exist. In return, the state of Utah will receive approximately 167,000 acres of federal lands located in 20 counties throughout the state, with lesser environmental sensitivity, but greater potential for generating revenue for Utah's public education system. Again, the purpose for which Congress originally granted trust lands to Utah and other western states. These lands have been targeted for oil and gas development, mining, renewable energy projects, real estate development, and land sales. The proposed land exchange will allow our agency to do what it does best, make money for our public schools, while allowing the Department of Interior to implement unified management of the monument consistent with conservation goals. I respectfully urge the subcommittee and Congress to approve S 1405. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you. Mr. Herringer.
Madam Chair, Cortez Masto, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I would also like to thank our North Dakota delegation, Senators Hoeven and Kramer, and Representative Armstrong, for their instrumental work in helping to move this important bill forward. My name is Joseph Herringer, and I am the North Dakota Commissioner of University and School Lands. As Commissioner, I lead the North Dakota Department of Trust Lands, the agency responsible for managing lands that were granted to North Dakota by Congress at statehood for the financial support of public education and other state institutions. The department is overseen by the North Dakota Board of University and School Lands, consisting of the Governor, the Attorney General, Secretary of State, Treasurer, and Superintendent of Public Instruction. The department manages approximately 2.6 million mineral acres and over 700,000 surface acres. Revenue generated from this acreage is deposited into 13 permanent trust funds and invested to provide long-term income for beneficiaries such as public schools, colleges and universities, and state institutions that support disabled populations. The largest fund is the North Dakota Common Schools Trust Fund, which has a current balance of approximately $6 billion. I asked the committee to support Senate Bill 1088, the North Dakota Trust Lands Completion Act of 2023, as it would allow North Dakota and the Department of the Interior to exchange lands for two mutually beneficial purposes. First, providing North Dakota with more productive and easily accessible lands for increased revenue to support public education. And second, helping North Dakota tribal nations to further consolidate lands within their reservations so they can manage and develop the land as they see fit. For this bill, we are proud to have the support of North Dakota's full congressional delegation, impacted North Dakota tribal nations, educational organizations, and Governor Burgum. There are currently 31,000 surface acres owned by North Dakota that are within the reservation boundaries of North Dakota tribal nations. This is due to the checkerboard pattern of land ownership that has evolved since statehood in 1889. This acreage is often difficult for North Dakota to access and manage, and thus cannot be fully developed pursuant to the state's mandate of generating income for schools, universities, and other public purposes. Utilizing the historic tool of in lieu relinquishments and selections, this bill would allow North Dakota to relinquish state lands trapped within tribal reservations to the Secretary of Interior and select in lieu thereof federal land or mineral rights located elsewhere in the state. This would allow North Dakota to access and fully develop the lands it was promised upon statehood. Within tribal reservations, lands received by the Secretary and these transactions would be held in trust for the tribes. This would help tribes consolidate land within their reservation boundaries for greater ownership and control. The bill also requires the Secretary and North Dakota to consult with tribes that would be affected by any proposed transactions. Such transactions must be deemed of equal value under federally recognized appraisal standards and methodologies, and it is important to note these would not be exchanges under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. As an example, North Dakota could propose the exchange of state-owned surface acres within a reservation for federally owned mineral rights elsewhere in the state that are in the development path of mineral producers. The Secretary would then review the proposal, consult with the affected tribe, And the transaction could also be done where North Dakota receives surface rights elsewhere in the state for the relinquishment of surface rights within a reservation. Land conveyed under this bill would be subject to all applicable federal, state, and tribal law, and valid existing rights will be respected in these transactions. There will be no impact on any Indian treaty rights. This is good legislation that promotes the shared interest and mutually beneficial goals of North Dakota, the federal government, and North Dakota tribal nations. Thank you for your time and consideration. I would be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you so much to the panelists. Then, so we're going to start the committee questions. I'll kick it off here. Mr. Ensminger, let me talk to you a little bit about the S-2042, the Sloan Canyon Horizon Lateral Bill. Thank you so much. You really identified the necessary items that were important, or why the Horizon Lateral needs to occur, the reliability, the redundancy across the Las Vegas Valley, backup support for important water transmission for over 1 million people and 40% of the businesses in Las Vegas Valley, including the city of Henderson. So I appreciate your comments. You also addressed the water use. And so let me have you just focus on this one more time. How does the creation of the Horizon Lateral impact the region's water use? Where's this water coming from?
As I said in my oral testimony, the construction and ultimate operation of the Horizon Lateral will not increase our water usage whatsoever. It's important to keep in mind that the way the water system works for Southern Nevada is we have a pumping station on Lake Mead. That station is capable of pumping 900 million gallons a day, and then it's conveyed over the mountains into Las Vegas and distributed through the system. All this pipeline does is give us better redundancy within that distribution system. It does not increase the pumping capacity from Lake Mead at all. So it will have zero impact on the Colorado River as a resource.
And if we don't have this redundancy, what's your concern?
Our concern is that even though 25 years isn't that old for water infrastructure needs to be taken down for weeks, sometimes months at a time for maintenance, even in the absence of an emergency situation. And we think that our South Valley lateral will need to be taken down for maintenance as early as 2030. So we really have an urgency to get going with the project. And if we are not able to go on the southern alignment, ultimately we're going to have no choice but to go on that northern alignment and have those, pretty significant impacts to our community that I've outlined.
And so let's talk about that, and I appreciate your comments, because you've really done your analysis on the impacts and why this is needed, but the impacts to the environment and to the local community. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between the preferred route and what you call the northern route? And discuss the difference in the impacts to the physical environment by going through the route underneath the conservation area as proposed in the bill, compared to the impacts in the alternate route that would go underneath and through the city of Henderson. What are we talking about here?
Sure. Well, for the southern alignment and for impacts within the National Conservation Area specifically, the only time we need to be inside the conservation area is to do some boreholes ahead of the tunneling underneath the conservation area. We've already done some of these boreholes outside of the NCA, and the equipment is airlifted in. It's a very small footprint, about the size of this red carpet in front of us, and we have before and after pictures that have been submitted as part of my written testimony, and the after pictures show, I would challenge anyone to go out and find the 6-inch borehole after the restoration has been done. There is literally no impact within the National Conservation Area to the surface.
And you have experience with doing boreholes, correct? I mean, you successfully and have experience around this, so you can really identify how you would mitigate any damage to the environment and what that process would look like and whether it would be successful or not.
Absolutely. We have significant tunneling experience in this exact same geology. Our tunneling experience is probably best exemplified by the completion of the third intake, which is a 3-mile tunnel underneath Lake Mead. When we were doing that tunnel, our tunnel boring machine encountered pressures of up to 17 bar, which is 35,000 pounds per foot. For frame of reference, when England and France built the Channel, the highest pressures they saw were 10 bars. So we're less than 2/3 of the pressures that we faced under Lake Mead is what they saw in the English Channel. So we have extensive tunneling experience, and frankly, going through solid rock underneath the conservation area is going to be relatively simple to some of the projects we've undertaken in the past.
And the alternative is, and if you would talk a little bit of that, because this actually goes through major populated areas, and the impact it would have to those. Can you talk a little bit about?
Sure. Well, I mentioned the 50-foot trenches down major roadways. Those will literally close businesses. For years at a time. They will mandate detours around to the entrance to emergency rooms at several hospitals. As you're aware, St. Rose Parkway is the heart of Henderson's medical district. Major regional parks will be turned into staging areas where pipeline segments will take those parks out of commission for 7 to 8 years so that we can dig the trenches and tunnel through the parts of the city that we feel comfortable that we can tunnel through without impacting major infrastructure. So it will have close to a decade of significant economic and human impact by going to the north.
And you talked a little bit about by going through the southern route through Sloan Canyon, you would save $200 million. But you would also save economic impact to those businesses had you chosen the other route. In other words, by shutting down those businesses that are going through the middle of town, you're really having a negative impact on their businesses, right? So that's going to cost millions of dollars, I would imagine, to those businesses if we're having to shut them down to put a necessary redundant pipe through the middle of town.
Yeah, absolutely. The socioeconomic impacts of going to the north far outweigh, as I described, the de minimis impacts of going to the south.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Senator Lee.
Thank you very much. Director McConkey, I'd like to start with you. Thanks again for the vital work you do in managing SITLA. SITLA, of course, is something that provides a vital lifeline for a number of critical services in the state of Utah, including and especially public education. Optimal land management allows us to not only be good stewards of the land, but also simultaneously promote and create sustainable economic growth opportunities, which of course benefits the public interest. A land exchange of this magnitude, of the sort that we're talking about in Utah, is certainly a delicate process that involves listening to all the relevant stakeholders and implementing their recommendations while trying to strike balance and compromise in a way, along the way in a way that doesn't derail the deal. Can you just explain briefly to the committee the stakeholder-driven process that went into creating this consensus legislation and how it would benefit Utah?
Thank you. Yes, we've gone through a long process of outreach. We've spent quite a bit of time, especially in San Juan County, which is the county that, of course, the majority of this land is coming out of. We've actually kept about 1/3 of the land that would be traded into within the boundary of San Juan County, and that's the heaviest we've ever gone into one single county, and this would be the 6th major land exchange Utah has done, and that's the heaviest we've ever stayed in a county. We've done public open houses where we had people of all backgrounds, residents, members sort of on both sides of the political aisle who attended, and we were able to have some really great listening sessions. We worked with local county commissioners, and they actually were very instrumental in helping us to understand the needs of their communities and what they really wanted to see and what economic development could come out of this exchange. And we listened very closely to that. Also listened to industry, and we have a lot of internal experts within our agency, all of whom added to help us figure out what targets would best serve our beneficiaries and also help with local economic development.
Thank you. Now, as you know, San Juan County, which is Utah's poorest county, was hit particularly hard by the designation of the Bears Ears National Monument. And the vast majority of the parcels that SITLA is trading out of come from San Juan County. This process has caused some frustration, and understandably so, but it's clear that SITLA has gone way above and beyond the call of duty to identify and trade into new parcels in San Juan County, parcels that have maximal economic development potential. Can you speak to this process a little bit and that feature in particular, how the exchange exchange lands were selected and how the proposed exchange is likely to affect the local economy in San Juan County?
Yes, well, these lands that we currently have in San Juan County within the boundaries of Bears Ears they're scattered parcels that have had limited historical revenue to the trust. About $80,000 a year is what we make out of about 136,000 acres of land. And really none of that money goes directly to local communities. That's going directly to the trust. This is an opportunity to take those scattered lands, block them up, move them into other parts of the county where we've done some Utah geological survey work, and these are areas with higher mineral potential and mineral development potential. So, as you said, San Juan County has struggled economically, and without this exchange, we don't see anything changing. The lands would stay where they are. This gives an opportunity for these lands to be blocked up, for there to be mineral development and real estate development, and we've worked very closely with the county commission and with others in the area to try to identify lands that can really help them with that.
Now, if SITLA pulls out of the boundaries of the monument, some worry that access to the land within the monument could somehow be threatened. Ranchers have relied on the checkerboard patch quilt nature of the SITLA parcels over the years in order to place grazing assets and water features. How will valid permits and reliance interests like these be affected by this land exchange?
We've worked very closely with ranchers and livestock producers in the area. We know that this is a difficulty for them. We've also worked very hard with BLM, and they've been great partners in this. We've actually come to agreements that there will be preference rights that BLM, that's in the MOU for permittees that are currently on lands and that would become state lands, and state lands would become federal lands, and we've also agreed to have 2 terms of no competition for the vice versa. We have worked very hard to get improvements in place, water improvements in place for these livestock producers, and feel that we've tried to listen as much as we can. We understand this is difficult for them, but feel like we have really put some protections in place, and we each have agreed to assume the obligations of the other as we are taking any of these valid existing rights.
How about water rights? Same thing?
Water rights, they would pass to the other party, but yes, that's something we've been looking at very closely. And we had a bunch of wells that we already had applications when we started the negotiation process, and many of those have been drilled. We worked with BLM to identify the correct places for them. It helps disperse cattle, and they're actually a very small footprint, but we work closely with the producers and with BLM on those issues.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Daines.
Madam Chair, thank you. Deputy Chief French, the Forest Service determined the Middle Fork Judith Wilderness Study Area was unsuitable for wilderness over 30 years ago, and then again in the fall of 2021. Could you briefly talk about what led to this determination and what public input there was in that process?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Senator. The Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest currently went through a forest plan revision, and so they followed the processes that are outlined in our 2012 planning rule. So essentially what they do is they go through the entire national forest, and they first inventory lands that have the potential to become wilderness, and then they evaluate those. And it goes through a very extensive public process to make that evaluation, both in areas that we'd recommend and both in areas that were currently part of the wilderness study area. Those then go through a set of alternatives for the forest plan revision, and then the decision that comes out of that, which again is probably, in this case, it was a 3 to 4 year process based on what we heard from the public and that extensive evaluation about if those lands are actually suitable is what we make our recommendations based off of.
Thank you. There's just been, I think, some misinformation back home from some who suggest there isn't a public process going through this, and obviously there is, as you just so well articulated. Some people have the misconception that by removing the wilderness study designation, we're removing all protections. Could you explain what protections will remain in place after this area is returned to general management?
The forest plan and their recommendations, in this case, for removing of the wilderness study area, essentially would keep in place protections that are consistent with backcountry and roadless type management. So what that means specifically is that it's not suitable for commercial timber harvest. It's managed more for broad-scale, large-scale conservation and for primitive backcountry uses.
Yeah. I hope the folks back home who have been fighting on this hear that, because there's just a lot of really still strong protections in place once the WSA designation would be removed. Assistant Director Heinlein, the Bureau of Land Management reaffirmed that the Hoodoo Mountain Wilderness Study Area and the Wales Creek Wilderness Study Area did not meet the criteria for lands with wilderness characteristics just 3 years ago in their revision of the Missoula Resource Management Plan. But in your testimony, you say that the recommendation for release is over 30 years old. Can you describe the 5-year collaborative process that went into the revision of the Missoula Resource Management Plan and why you don't consider this process and the public input that was included to be a reaffirmation of the original recommendation?
Thank you for the question, Senator. In the 2021 Missoula RMP revision that you mentioned, it's explicitly stated in the RMP that, and I'll quote, that designating lands as wilderness or removing the wilderness study area designations is outside the BLM's authority and was beyond the scope of this revision. Therefore, the Resource Management Plan did not make any determinations as to whether any wilderness study areas was indeed unsuitable for wilderness. However, as you've noted when you talked about the Forest Service, WSA's, the RMP did, however, outline alternative management for wilderness study areas should they be released by Congress in the future.
And so, I mean, I realize the buck stops with Congress in terms ultimately of whether or not we release it or move into wilderness study, but the Forest Service makes recommendations on either suitable or not, but you're saying BLM doesn't?
The suitability determinations that were made in the 1992 and 1993 are the recommendations that stand today.
Okay, they still stand today then. Okay, thank you. Deputy Chief French and Assistant Director Heinlein, as wildfire season continues, how would returning these areas to general management might improve your ability to proactively manage them to mitigate the risk of catastrophic wildfires? We'll start with Mr. French.
Given the time here, I'll kind of land it in two places. It changes the approaches you use with suppression of fires, using less, we call mist-type techniques. That can change if the fire is getting out of control, and it changes our ability for mechanical treatments. When it is wilderness, we primarily rely on prescribed fire as a way to reduce wildland fire risk in wilderness areas versus other areas where we have a broader set of tools available to us.
Mr. Heinlein?
Yeah, similar to what Mr. French described, we would apply the same suite of tools, the same minimum impact suppression techniques that were mentioned. I would also mention that in the case of these two wilderness study areas that are the topic of the BLM lands in this discussion, if Congress were to release them and they were to become backcountry conservation areas or areas of critical environmental concern, as the Missoula Resource Management Plan prescribes, the suppression tactics would be similar to as they are today. It would be the same standard.
Deputy Chief French, the last question. The roadless rule limits timber harvest and mining substantially, but does allow access to restoration work and habitat improvement work for threatened and endangered species. Can you discuss what this means for WSAs when they are returned to general management?
So if they are contained within areas that were covered administratively by our roadless rule, what the roadless rule does is prohibit commercial timber harvest, which means you can't rotate and manage the timber towards on a commercial basis. It does not prevent you from using mechanical means or timber harvest techniques to reduce wildland fuel loading, to create broader restoration needs. Let's say you're protecting a source watershed, or for thinning or something that is needed to protect a critical species. It just limits you from managing it as essentially a commercially based timber harvest stand.
Yeah, but thinning would be allowed there for what you talked about as a way to improve habitat.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for your time and your service. I wanted to take the moment and just ask Mr. French, just because we're on firefighting, and this isn't reflective to a specific bill, but I did get into a long discussion, which has led to several other discussions with amateur fire theorists around the Smokey the Bear issues. You know, how have we made our forests more susceptible? But I also read 20 years ago a book called The Big Burn by Timothy Egan that talks about the fire of 1910, I believe, long before Smokey came into. Matter of fact, the cause of Smokey the Bear, the National Forest Service, by most accounts. Anyway, so that at that time there had been all the natural burns had been going through, and yet they had this pernicious drought and had a fire that was literally unlike anything we've even seen today. How does that get explained in terms of modern fire theory?
Well, I mean, okay, I really appreciate the question because, I mean, I think sometimes we make these issues too black and white. The reality is that most western forests, especially dry forests, burned in a regular fashion. And there were periods where you might have significant drought, such as the time that led up to the Big Burn in Montana that created large-scale fires and large-scale devastation. Probably wasn't felt as much because you didn't have as much development and urbanization as we do today. That's one of the significant things that changed. We live in much more concentrated centers in and around our forests than we did before. We've been very successful at suppressing fires. We suppressed 98% of our fires in the first 24 hours. Actually, it might be the first 48 hours, but it's one of those two. But that has had this other effect, and that is that forests, especially forests that had frequent fire cycles, most of your Sierras, a lot of the Rockies, especially ponderosa-dominated forests, not necessarily some of those places you might find in Alaska, but they have grown and grown and grown. Forests that normally would have been thinned by fires that typically maybe had 40 to 60 trees per acre now have 400 to 600 trees per acre. So when fires burn now, they burn at intensities that take out everything. You add climate change amplifies the effect of our own management that have created today's conditions, and that's resulting in a wildfire crisis.
Got it. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
I will. Someday I'll chase you down, and we'll have a long. As a governor for 8 years, and we had several of the worst wildfire seasons in the history of the state, and it is obviously multivariate equation and not easy. But that's for another time.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you, and thank you for your service. Mr. Heinlein, over the course of 15 years, we've had counties, farmers, whitewater advocates, conservation groups, water managers, the Ute Mountain Utes down in the southwest corner of Colorado, all working together to create the Dolores River National Conservation Area and Special Management Area Act, which you've heard a little bit about already from Senator Bennett. Was engaged in the efforts to develop the bill, and I'm glad to join him and co-sponsorship with him and support the legislation today. I think it really is a bill that strikes a balance, protecting close to 70,000 acres of public lands in Colorado, including some of that beautiful red rock country that is all along the Dolores River, or most of the Dolores River. And this bill also respects and protects historic water rights and other historic uses. The broadly supported solutions in the bill offer a perfect example of Coloradans from across various interests, across parties, coming together to share. The word I always used to use is topophilia, a love of place, that really helps make our state and so much of the West so beautiful. Can you tell me more about how the NCA designation actually is going to help the BLM manage these lands and how the BLM would continue to work with local stakeholders that have helped get us here?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Maybe I'll just start with the second piece first. So, broadly, the BLM recognizes the importance of locally crafted conservation solutions and recreation, focused on conservation and recreation areas on BLM-managed public lands and waters. And we believe that's the most effective and enduring conservation strategy, considering the priorities, the needs, and the perspectives of the families and all of the communities, tribal interests that you mentioned. So absolutely, we find over and over those are the best and most enduring solutions. So we certainly support that and how this bill has been developed. Specifically, the National Conservation Area designation on BLM-managed lands would enhance our ability to manage many of the resources that you touched on. Just the setting, the Red Rock Canyon setting with the Ponderosa Pines within it, which is so unique in that landscape, the broader landscape, when you pop up out of the canyon into the working farmlands. It makes it so unique. And specifically, some of the other conservation values, the fisheries, the whitewater rafting, the industry of that, the recreational use of that. Those are just a couple of examples that this bill and the designation would really help and enhance us with our management of.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. So Senator Lee and I have a couple more questions, I think one each to ask, and I will start. First of all, Mr. Heinlein, Mr. French, thank you. Thank you for your response. Thank you for being attentive to the 17 bills that are before us. Can I get a commitment from both of you that you would be willing to follow up on some of the technical assistance you provided and assistance for several of the bills, including the 3 of mine that are introduced?
Absolutely. For the Bureau of Land Management, you have our full commitment.
Thank you.
Same.
Thank you. Mr. Heinlein, let me ask you this question, and this has to do with S 1622, which is the bill I introduced to end speculative oil and gas leasing. In BLM's guidance for implementing the Inflation Reduction Act's oil and gas leasing reforms, BLM's criteria for evaluating lease nominations would take into account the potential for development when determining which lands to offer for lease, with preference given to those lands with high potential. In April, however, BLM appeared ready to offer tens of thousands of acres for lease that meet the criteria for rejection. Fortunately, several low potential parcels were removed from consideration, will not be offered in the upcoming lease sale. My question to you is, how is BLM using its authorities to curb that speculative leasing and avoiding leasing of lands with low or no oil and gas potential? And do you expect the forthcoming rule to more concretely disqualify low and no potential lands from being offered for lease?
Thank you for the question. On this particular question, Chairman Cortez Masto, so I represent the National Conservation Lands portfolio of the Bureau of Land Management, and I would be very happy to delve into your question a little more thoroughly and give you a proper answer for the record on that. I know we have been working on policy within the Bureau on our oil and gas leasing program, and I'd be happy to check in with my counterparts and get you a proper answer.
Thank you. And before I give this to Senator Lee, let me just make one statement. On 1760, which is the Apex Area Technical Corrections Act, literally I was just out there. I was home at Apex, and here's the challenge. And this is all we're asking, is as we develop the infrastructure out there, the way the law is currently written, every individual business has to seek a permit for the same right-of-way, whether they're laying pipe or they are putting fiber down there. And so you're asking every individual business to seek the same permit from BLM. So the goal here is to allow either the City of North Las Vegas or the association to actually build out that infrastructure, get those permits to build out the infrastructure to bring it to the businesses instead of having each individual business go through that process, which has caused a delay in the build out of that industrial park. So that's really the intent here, and I look forward to working with you on that legislation as well. Senator Lee.
Thank you. I'll be as quick as I can. Just a couple of questions. First, Director McConkey, it's hard to fully evaluate any bill without assessing the meaningful benefits that come from the bill. And each year, the Sitla Trust Fund distributes millions of dollars to support public schools and some other institutions across Utah. How will this exchange in particular further that mission?
Thank you for the question. It allows us to block up land that, due to its scattered nature or the location in more remote areas with less development potential, it allows us to block that up and really be able to generate revenue to the extent that we should be generating revenue. It allows us to utilize that land the way it was intended, and it helps us, but as we've also talked about, it helps economic development in some of these rural communities. As you mentioned in your opening statements, more than the majority of land in Utah is actually owned by the federal government. And when you look at rural Utah, when you take out the Wasatch Front, which is the most heavily populated, it's even a much higher number than that. San Juan County only has about 6% of the land that's in private ownership. So this is an opportunity for the school children of the state to make money, as these lands were intended to do. And it also allows local economic development. It puts us into areas where we can look at renewable energy projects, oil and gas, critical minerals, real estate development, all of those things. These targets, a lot of time was spent figuring out, working with industry, working with experts, working with local communities, figuring out what would be best for us and for these local communities.
Thank you. And Dr. Heinlein, I've got one question for you as well. Thank you for being here and testifying today. The state of Utah has identified some plots of land that would be appropriate for conveyance from a number of locations from the BLM to the state to provide for more adequate management. A number of these parcels are either completely placed entirely within or alternatively directly adjacent to some of our state parks, including Antelope Island State Park and Wasatch Mountain State Park. These plots would be better managed by the Utah Department of Natural Resources, as the land surrounding the parcels is already designated as a state park and managed well, as all of our state parks are. This would allow the streamlining of maintenance of land management to state agencies who can be much more responsive with unique needs. It also seems to me that the conveyances would be a win-win for Utah and the federal government. It benefits both parties. It'd allow the state to take the lead on resource management, such as maintenance and wildfire management in places where the state's already operating, while allowing the federal government to focus on more pressing land management objectives that only it can perform. Now, in your testimony, you talked about the land management difficulties that BLM deals with because of the federal ownership of these isolated parcels within Antelope Island State Park and near Wasatch Mountain State Park. Could you speak to some of those land management challenges and what they are?
Certainly. I'd be happy to speak to those, Senator, and I would like to say to open that obviously, and it's reflected in our testimony, that the BLM does support this bill for many of the reasons that you just described. Some of the scattered parcels, they just present a management challenge in trying to perform some type of federal management action, given all of the edge effect of the adjacent, in this case, state ownership, or in many other cases, private ownership, which can complicate and add to the complexity of actually performing actions on those parcels of land. So we do view this as a win-win situation, as you described, and are fully supportive.
Great. Thank you. I look forward to working with BLM and the Forest Service on the implementation language of the bill, and hope we can work together on a solution that solves these management issues. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And once again, I want to thank the witnesses. Thank you for appearing here today. Thank you for traveling here. Thank you always for being responsive. Some members of the committee may submit additional questions in writing, and if so, we will ask you to submit answers for the record. Committee members will have until 6 p.m. tomorrow to submit additional questions for the record, and we will keep the hearing record open for 2 weeks to receive any additional comments. Thank you again, and the subcommittee is adjourned.